Alrighty, in this video we're going to be looking at aggregate demand and going to go over just a couple of the basic things about it. We're going to distinguish it between the concept of demand for a product. We're going to go over how to construct an aggregate demand curve and then explain why it has a negative slope. We're also going to look at the four components of aggregate demand: the consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. That is the C plus I plus G plus NX. Then we're going to look at the determinants of aggregate demand. What would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift one way or another? So before we start off, excuse me, when we look at the word aggregate, the term aggregate demand, this term aggregate, or to aggregate something, that simply says to sum something up. And so really what aggregate demand is, it's the sum of all the demand curves of all the products in the country. Okay? And so it's not the demand for one thing, it's the demand for everything. So we aggregate all of those demand curves, or aggregate all of the demand that's out there in the country, and then we put that all together and we come up with the aggregate demand curve. Now, let's look at how to graph this out, all right? Because it's going to look a lot like the regular demand curve, all right? But when we have this axis, because now we're talking about macroeconomic concept, and macro obviously means the big picture, all right? And so instead of graphing one product, so we used to graph it P and a Q, we're going to do a PL, and the PL stands for price level. Excuse me. So price level, and this is a measure of inflation. So we're going to use a price index, and we know that we can use the consumer price index, the CPI, or we could use the GDP deflator. That's an index that measures the price changes for all of the products out there. And so this is just measuring the price level on here. So if we have a rise in inflation, we would say the price level moves up that way. All right, and so that's the difference between the regular demand graph and the aggregate demand graph. So this simply measures the price level, what's going on with prices in the country. And down here we're going to look at the quantity. And remember, one of the things that when we did GDP was simply a measure of what? All right, it was a measure of output. There's a longer flowery definition that goes along with this, but the general sense is GDP measures output, and so what we're measuring down here is the output of the economy. And so where we have the quantity, we're going to put GDP, and we can put an R in parentheses, or we can put real GDP, but this stands for real GDP at the bottom. All right, so when we can construct the aggregate demand curve, it does have this downward slope, and then we would just put an AD there, and then you get that's how you construct it. All right, very simple. Looks just like the demand curve, but it's got this downward slope for a couple of different reasons than the regular aggregate demand, the regular demand curve. So the first reason, and these are three that you're going to know, so make sure you copy these down. All right, the first reason for this downward slope is what they call the real balances effect. That's an E, isn't it? Real balances effect. Now what this says is that let's say that you have $100. All right, so you got $100, and the price level is, say, here. All right. Now what's going to happen to the price? What's going to happen to your $100 if the price level starts to rise? In other words, if inflation starts to go up, and so you would say, well, your $100 is actually, it doesn't have the same purchasing power that it did before. And if you don't have the same purchasing power that you did before, you're not going to buy as much stuff. And so, if we're here, let's say that the price index is 150, and this is everybody's income. And so let's say that given that income, we're going to buy, 100 trillion, no, not 100 trillion, $100 billion worth of stuff. And so if the CPI goes up to, say, 175, then we know that inflation is starting to happen, and the purchasing power of people's money starts to go down, and so they simply can't buy nearly as much stuff. And so instead of 100 billion, maybe we're down to 40 billion. All right, and remember, this was measuring real GDP. If we were measuring nominal GDP, if the prices go up, nominal would go up, but most likely. But anyway, so this is a measure of real GDP. So if inflation goes up, our purchasing power goes down, and that's what they call the real balances effect. Conversely, if we have deflation in the economy, all right, there would be the price index going down, then the purchasing power of the dollar would rise, all right, and we would be able to buy more stuff, and we would as a country. All right, so this is the first one. The second reason is what they call the interest rate effect. Interest rate effect. Okay, so let's say that the inflation starts to rise. All right, and there's two ways of looking at this, and I'll go over both of them. But let's say the inflation rate starts to rise, and so what's happening to the demand for money? All right, so the demand for money, if everything's starting to go up in price, then the demand for money is going to go up because we simply need more money. And so if the interest rate's going up, it's going to be an increase in the demand for money. All right, and if the demand for money goes up, what's that going to cause the interest rates to do? All right, and that's going to cause the interest rates to go up. The little I stands for interest rates. And if interest rates go up, what's going to happen to consumer spending? All right, so decrease spending. All right, so again, if the interest rates go up, if inflation goes up, the price index goes up, we have an increase in the demand for money, which causes interest rates to rise. And when interest rates rise, it becomes more expensive to buy houses and to buy cars. And if you're a business, you're less likely to invest in new equipment for your factory. You might put off building another factory. So that would be, that's generally it. Now, another way of looking at this, let me do it up here in a different color. And I'm foreshadowing a little bit, but when we talk about interest rates, we look at n plus I plus pi e. All right, and so the n stands for the nominal interest rate. So this is what you and I pay as consumers. So when we go to the bank, this is what the bank charges us. And so how does the bank derive that? So this is the little I stands for the real rate. All right, and the pi e stands for the expected rate of inflation. Expected rate of inflation. All right, and so when you add these two together, so this is where the banks compete with each other. Let's say one bank will accept 3% rate of return. Another bank might say, you know what, we'll take 2 3/4% rate of return. And so this is where they compete. This expected rate of inflation, oftentimes it's the forecast typically of the Federal Reserve. And so let's say that the current expected rate of inflation is 2%. Okay, and so the real rate, let's say that banks, they want to make sure they get 3% worth, 3% return, and so this would mean that the interest rate that you and I would receive, the nominal interest rate, would be 5%. And so looking at this equation, when you come over here, if we have an increase in the price level, which is inflation, if the expected rate of inflation starts to rise, so let's say instead of 2%, this changes to, get a different color here, instead of 2%, now we're at 4%, what happens to this number over here? Okay, so that would cause that to go up to 7% because we have the real rate, banks are keeping that the same, but expected rate of inflation is going up, that's 4%, so we would have a new higher nominal rate, and with that increased nominal interest rate, we would buy less stuff, again, because it's more expensive. So let me clean that up just a bit. All right. So that's the second reason for this downward slope of the curve. All right, remember we've got the first one is the real balances effect. Second one is the interest rate effect. And then the third one is the foreign purchases effect. Foreign purchases effect. Let's say that in the U.S., you were in the market in the U.S. for a football, about Nerf footballs, and everything else. Okay, so you're in the market for everything, and so if we have an increase in the price level, what's happening to the price generally of everything? Remember that an increase in the price level just tells us that there's an increase in the general level of prices in the economy. It's not for every single item, but overall. And so let's say Nerf footballs were part of this. What's going to happen? Where are you going to go buy your Nerf footballs if the price of a Nerf football here goes up to $30 or something. And so you're going to go look around and say, you know what, Canada, you guys make Nerf footballs as well, or something similar to Nerf footballs. We'll go ahead and buy your stuff. And so this is what happens. If the price level rises over here, then foreign goods become relatively less expensive than they were before. And so if the price level rises here, we stop buying as much from our country, from the producers in our country, and we instead buy them from producers of a foreign country. And it works again in the opposite direction. All right. And so what would happen if oops, hang on. What would happen if the price level went down? You know, so instead of, let's say we were started off at $10, what happens if the price level goes down to $5? Then that means foreigners will want to purchase more of our stuff. So now people in Canada who are buying Canadian Nerf footballs look at us and say, you know what, relatively speaking, because of this change in the inflation rate in the United States, these Nerf footballs have become less expensive to buy from the United States. And so if the price level goes down, the aggregate demand in our economy would rise. All right. So that's that. We've constructed an aggregate demand curve. All right. So we just do that by, it's a downward sloping curve, and we've talked about why it has a negative slope, and it's these three reasons: the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign purchases effect. So make sure you have a good understanding and grasp of those. So let's go to the next one. And I know that this one's going to be a little bit longer. I'd rather just do it all in one than break it up into three different video clips. So, all right, describe consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports as the components of aggregate demand. Woo. So let's draw, they should give us a draw line tool. Something like that would be wonderful. All right, so let's do that. And there we go. And hopefully I can get this back. All right, so we're going to say that, remember, what goes here? This is our quantity, and this is, we'll just say, real GDP. I know I drew it the other way on the other side. It doesn't matter. And this is our aggregate demand curve. And up here is our price level. All right, so when you draw this out, what I want you to realize is, again, this is the overall spending of everybody, the demand for all of the American products. All right, and so who out there buys the products from the United States? And so we have consumers. All right, they do the consumption. All right, we also have, who else buys stuff? Remember, this is something like 70% of the economy, give or take. Who else buys the stuff? We have businesses. Businesses buy capital equipment, new factories, they might buy new tools, things like that. So we have the C for consumption, I for business investments, and this is, in the neighborhood of 16% or so, give or take. Who else buys stuff? All right, the government, they buy a lot of stuff in the U.S., so we'll call that the G, C plus I plus G, government spending. And again, I think in the U.S. economy, we might be hovering around 20%, which is historically high for us, but that's a policy debate that we won't go into here. And then the last thing, we have people buying our products, and we also have us buying other people's products, and that's what we call net exports. And so again, in the U.S., this is somewhere around -3%. I know this doesn't add up to 100, but these are just rough figures. All right, and so when we look at aggregate demand, it's really these four things. All right, and this is it's critical just to get this very simple little formula down, because when we graph this out and we start shifting the curve, it's easy to remember. It's easy to figure out what happens to the curve if you keep in mind that aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus NX. All right, and what I mean by that is, and we're going to get into the determinants here in just a second, but what if I said, consumer spending goes up, consumption goes up? All right, that's going to shift this whole curve. Let's get another color here. That's going to shift this whole curve to the right. All right. And so what if government spending goes up? That's going to shift the curve again to the right. What if business investments go way down? Well, that's going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. And so whenever you're given a scenario, all you need to do is think, what happens to either consumption, business investments, government spending, or net exports? Because if these arrows go up, if if any of these arrows go up, then aggregate demand goes to the right. If any of these arrows go down, then aggregate demand goes to the left. It's that simple. All right. That's why it's important to keep this in mind. So when you're given a scenario, if they cut people's taxes, what's going to happen? Cut personal income taxes. Well, that's going to go up, and so in this graph, aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. All right, and so let's go over the actual determinants of these four things. Okay, what's going to cause these things to shift? So the first one, the determinants of aggregate demand, or the causes of the shift, and we'll deal with, hang on just a sec. We'll deal with consumption first. All right, and this is going to be a little bit tedious, and I apologize, but what are the things that will cause consumption to change? All right, so the first one, and remember we're going to use the triangle for the change. The first one that we'll list, and again I'm pulling these from the IB diploma, the IB economics syllabus, so it's a good list. Some other textbooks have one or two different ones, but anyway, so the first one that we'll talk about is a change in consumer confidence. All right, if you feel good about the economy and I feel good about the economy, what are we going to go do? We're going to go spend our money. And when we do that, what happens to consumption? Consumption would increase, which would cause an increase or shift to the right of the aggregate demand. Conversely, if we have a decrease in consumer confidence, then we would expect aggregate demand to come down. I believe it's the University of Michigan does a consumer confidence survey every month, and that's something that politicians watch a bunch, and economists, because if they can perceive that people's confidence is starting to rise, then it's kind of a foreshadowing that there might be an improvement in the economy if we're currently in a recession. Again, when we talked about John Keynes, his idea of consumer confidence, if anybody recalls, was this notion of animal spirits. Okay, and this applies to consumers and businesses, but the idea of animal spirits is that if the mood of the country, so for consumption, if your neighbor's spending money and the person beside them and your friends are starting to spend money, then it gets you into the mood that it's good to spend money, things are going pretty well, and so people go out and spend money. All right, same with businesses. If you're a business and you see all of your competitors starting to invest, then you say things must be going well, and so I'm going to go invest myself. And so that would be a change in consumer confidence. All right, the second one would be a change in interest rates. Again, an interest rate is simply the charge to borrow, the cost it is to borrow money. And so if I borrow $100 from you, and you say that'll be 10% interest, and I have to pay you back in a year, then I pay you the $100 back plus the 10%, which is $10. All right, so that's the interest rate. And so if interest rates go down, is it cheaper for me to borrow that $100 from you? So if the interest rates go from 10% down to 5%, now I only have to give you $105 back. All right, and so if the interest rates get lower, it makes buying cars cheaper, it makes buying houses cheaper, it makes buying washers and dryers and beds and you name it, whatever we buy by borrowing money, it makes it cheaper. And so if interest rates go down, and we'll say if interest rates go down, we would see an increase in the aggregate demand, and if interest rates go up, we would see a decrease in aggregate demand. Alrighty, so that's the second one. The third one that we want to look at is a change in wealth. All right, from the 1990s, we had an increase in the stock market, and we had a lot of people getting into the stock market. And with that increase in wealth, that would help drive a change in consumption. Back in late 2007, 2008, the market went down. All right. A little dramatic there, but so when the market went down like that, like it did, that caused people's household wealth to decline, and with that, they said we're not going to buy as much. And so, if a change in wealth, if there's an increase in wealth, then we're going to see an increase in aggregate demand, and if there's a decrease in wealth, we'll see a decrease in aggregate demand. Alrighty. The next one would be personal income taxes, and sometimes I've always put taxes in the government spending, but it is more appropriate here. So personal tax, change in personal taxes. And so what does this do to, remember this all revolves around your disposable income. All right, and so if the government says we're going to charge you a 30% tax rate and you earn $100,000, then obviously they're taking $30,000. All right, and so what if they say, you know what, instead of 30%, we're going to cut you down to 20%. Let me back up. And so if they're taking this 30,000, that means you have 70,000 disposable income. And so now what if they said we're going to lower it to 20%? The government's going to keep 20,000, and that leaves you with 80,000 of disposable income. And so your disposable income increased by 10,000, and you're not necessarily going to spend 100% of that, but you are going to spend more of it. And so if we lower personal income taxes, we typically would expect to see an increase in consumption. All right. Again, it doesn't always work quite as neatly as that because you may give people the money back and they may use it to pay off debt. And so paying off debt doesn't really help with consumption. You're just paying the credit card company or the bank or whoever it is. So you can't force people to spend it. But anyway, again, what if taxes rose? Instead of 30%, let's make it, in the U.S., we hit a high one time in the late 50s of 91%. And so if we do that, that means that the government is going to keep $91,000 of your money. That leaves you $9,000 left to spend. And so you would imagine that if that happened, that personal consumption would go way down, which would be very bad. This was when Eisenhower was president, and obviously this is too high. All right, there's big debate right now about where the appropriate tax rate should be, and that's another subject that we'll study later, but obviously 91% is too high and 0% is too low, so I think generally most people would say that it's going to be somewhere in between these numbers. All right, so let's go to the fifth one. All right, and that would be a change in household indebtedness. And household, we'll just say debt or indebtedness. So if you start to borrow a lot of money, you buy a car, you buy a house, all those things, then obviously that initial spending would increase aggregate demand. But or if you take out student loans, anything like that, if you have a medical event and you need to go to the hospital and you have bills there, anything that causes your household debt to rise, so an increase in household debt would cause a decrease in consumer spending. All right, and the same is true. If we lower household debt, then we would typically expect to see an increase in consumer spending. All right, so these are the five determinants for consumption. All right, so changing consumer confidence, interest rates, wealth. And so if we go back over to this other slide, we can take a look, hopefully. So if one of those determinants changes, let's say interest rates go down, we would see this shift to the right. All right, if we haven't gotten there, if they increased personal income taxes, then we would expect to see this shift to the left. All right, the others aren't quite as long, so I'll try and go a little bit faster. Let me erase this. Oops, not like that. Sorry about that. We'll get there. All right, so the next one we're going to look at is business investments. And so remember, these are businesses, and by investment we mean investment in capital goods. All right, so machinery, things like that. And so what's the one, well, there are a couple, but one of the bigger things is a change again in interest rates. And we'll see in another lesson that changes in business investments are the things that typically are the cause of the changes in the business cycle. Not all of them, but often. And so if we have an increase in interest rates, it becomes more expensive for businesses to buy things, and hence they will not buy as much. And if the interest rates go down, then that's an encouragement to businesses to buy stuff. So let's see, a decrease in the interest rates lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Increase in interest rates would lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. All right, number two. Let's see. Change in business confidence. Again, this is kind of like animal spirits, change in business confidence. If you're Verizon and you're looking out and you expect the economy to go bad, then you may not put more cell towers in, something like that. If you're a car company, you're going to look out, and if the forecast is gloomy, then you're going to cut back on your business investments. And so if the business confidence is bad, that would lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. And if business confidence is very good, then we would expect to see an increase in aggregate demand. All right. How about, let's see, number three, a change in technology. If you look at computers in the 90s, what happened how did that impact aggregate demand? And so whenever there's a big increase in a change in technology, so when computers were made more dominant, when they became more dominant in business, businesses really started to realize computers can help us a lot. All right, there was this kind of game-changing event that computers became useful to businesses, and so whenever that happens, they say, look, we need to buy a bunch of this stuff. All right. Same with the assembly line. When the assembly line started, it's like all the other companies would say, we need to figure out how to do this. We need to buy the machinery and the tools to make this happen. And so whenever we have a change in technology that's going to cause businesses to say, you know what, that stuff can make us a lot more efficient. We need to buy it. Whenever that technology comes out and is new, then you'll often see a big uptick in investments. All right. And if there's no change in technology, if technology is kind of stagnant for a while, then you might see a decrease. So change in technology. And let's see, the fourth one, change in business taxes. Similar thought to the change in personal income taxes. If there's an increase in business taxes, then we would expect to see a decrease in investments. Okay, so a decrease in investments, which leads to a decrease in aggregate demand. Conversely, if there's a decrease in business taxes, we would expect businesses to increase their investments, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. All right, and finally, the fifth one, change in corporate indebtedness. So you can see there's a lot of similarities between changes in investments and changes in consumption. So corporate debt, if corporations have a lot of debt, then they're going to say, you know what, it's not the best time to invest. And so, let's see, high debt could lead to a decrease in investments, and low debt might lead to an increase in investments. All right, and so those are the five determinants that will shift the aggregate demand curve. And again, let's go back here. So think of one of the ones that we listed on the other side. If business confidence goes up, then we would expect to see a shift to the right. If business confidence goes down, or let's say interest rates change and go up, then aggregate demand would shift to the right. All right, getting close to being done, so stick with me just a little bit longer. All right, so we have the C and the I. Now we need to do government spending. Government spending. All right, and what's going to cause governments to change what they do? And so really, this is the only one, a change in political and economic priorities. And where do those priorities come from? They often come from the politicians that we elect, and so in essence, we are the ones that dictate these political and economic priorities. So, if Barack Obama gets reelected, then we'd expect to see a certain set of spending priorities if he can work with Congress. Maybe not so lucky lately, but hopefully they could work together. If Mitt Romney gets elected, then we might see a different set of political and economic priorities. But looking at, remember, 2008. The name of that was the Great Recession. And so how did the government respond? And this was started by George Bush and then picked up by Barack Obama. And That was by spending lots of money. All right, and so they looked at the economic priority. The theory was from a lot of economists that we need to dump a lot of money into the economy to stop a Great Depression from happening. Again, that's a debatable thing, but obviously the political and economic priorities changed when the economy started to take a nosedive. All right, and so government spending increased a bunch. Now we might start to see, since we're so far in debt, remember we're something in the 15 to 16 trillion dollar range right now, and so at some point we may start to see Congress and the president say, you know what, it's time to slow down the spending, and so we're just going to spend this much money, and that would cause a decrease in government spending. So if you think about things like wars, World War II, if we go back over here to this other graph, when World War II happened, you saw government spending go way up, and so that would cause a big increase in aggregate demand. All right, anything that would cause a decrease in government spending would cause it to shift the other way. All right, then the last one. Sorry about that. The last. Let's see, what am I doing? That. And now that. All right, so the last one is a change in net exports. So, oops, change that. So, I want to look at net. Got some pen issues. Net exports. All right, what's going to cause net exports to change? So, one thing would be a change in income of your trading partners. All right, and so let's take China for example. So back in 2008, obviously the U.S. trades a lot with China. When 2008 hit, then everything went pretty south in the United States, and so what do you think happened to China? Okay, and that's the question. China was not very happy. They were very sad because we bought a lot of stuff from China, and when the recession hit, we slowed our spending down significantly. And so there's a phrase, I forget who said it, but the phrase is, when the U.S. Sneezes, the whole world catches a cold, and that is, if the U.S. Economy goes bad, then we trade with so many other people, and we buy so many other products around the world that it causes other economies to become sick. All right, and it works in the opposite direction. If the U.S. economy booms, then everybody else's economy does better that we buy from, and it works in the opposite direction. If Europe looks like part of it's going into a recession now, that's definitely going to affect the United States exporters. All right, and so if there's an increase in, let's say, increase in income of a trading partner, we would expect to see an increase in exports, which would cause an increase in net exports. Because remember, net exports is simply exports minus imports. So anything that drives exports up is going to cause aggregate demand to shift more to the right. Anything that drives imports up will cause it to shift to the left. All right, so that's the first one. Any kind of change in exchange rates is our second determinant, change in exchange rates. And so let's say that right now $1 gets me 5 pesos. All right, and I want to buy something for 20 pesos. All right, what if a dollar now gets me 10 pesos? What's going to happen to the amount of stuff I buy from Mexico? And if I can get 10 pesos instead of 5 pesos, that means I can buy twice as much. And so we would say that the dollar is appreciating here and the peso is depreciating. But so this change in the exchange rate, we'll talk about why that happens later, but this change in exchange rate will cause net exports to change. All right, and it can work in the opposite direction. If we go from 1 to 10 down to 1 to 5, same thing, only opposite. And then the last one, thank you for hanging with me, change in the level of protectionism. Protectionism is, boy, that is one sloppy word, protectionism. Protectionism is when a country will erect trade barriers because they don't want to promote free trade. They may say, you know what, we don't want y'all importing your corn or your grain or whatever into our country. We want to raise that up so we can help our local farmers here. All right, and so if there's an increase in protectionism, what's going to happen to exports and imports. So if there's an increase in protectionism, a lot of times that would cause uh, retaliatory actions by the other country. And so if China raised their protectionism, then we might raise ours. And so you might see exports actually go down. And so if that happens, then net exports would go down. All right. So anyway, also if you open up free trade, then you would expect to see net exports go up. So that's all of them. I know this was a big chunk, and I apologize, but I'm not going to review everything. But make sure you know. Actually, I'm going to review just. Give me one more minute. Just so you know, this is our aggregate demand curve. Slopes down. Here's the three reasons. Aggregate demand is made up of this consumer spending, business investments, government spending, and net exports. And if any of these changes, if any of these arrows go up, that's going to shift it to the right. If any of these arrows go down, it'll shift it to the left. Remember our graph, we have the price level here and real GDP there. And then you need to have some understanding of all the different determinants of aggregate demand. This is going to be critical for what we're doing for quite a while now. So anyway, hope that helped. Hope you took some good notes, and until next time.